The interesting avenues of investigation have become so convoluted as to be almost impenetrable to newcomers. Indeed, at this point, if the 9/11 Truth Movement's goal is to continue to expand and reach new audiences, it needs to do so in new ways. People who have not yet been exposed to, or not yet been convinced by, the ample evidence of extreme physical anomalies on that day, from the controlled demolitions of the towers to the very unusual events at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. If people are not interested in that evidence, or even the evidence that has been thoroughly documented by people like Webster Tarpley about the drills that were going on at the exact same time as the events that they were representing, then what is another way to get people into this? Of course, the investigation into the physical anomalies of that day is still of prime importance, but the research into those physical anomalies has now become so voluminous, so convoluted and impenetrable to outsiders or newcomers to the movement, that the impression is given that only credentialed experts could possibly decipher what really happened on that day. Likewise, many other avenues of investigation have been exhaustively explored by painstaking researchers like Webster Tarpley, who has done some of the best research on the drills that were taking place on that day that simulated the very events that were happening in real time. But it seems to me that there is another avenue for investigation, one that's often overlooked, yet in fact is one of the easiest to understand at a basic level, and one that offers an extremely fruitful area of investigation. In fact, perhaps the base of all serious criminal investigations on events of this magnitude. People have often heard the refrain, "follow the money," and of course an event like this is absolutely no different, even if you were to believe the official fairy tale of what happened on 9/11. You would still have to admit that following the money is of prime importance. In fact, one of the most important things that we can do to try to unravel what really happened on that day. Unless, of course, you listen to the 9/11 Commission. Yes, of course, the 9/11 Commission says that, don't worry, go back to sleep. There's nothing interesting to look at if you're interested in the financing of 9/11. Here's a quote directly from Chapter 5 of the 9/11 Commission report. Quote, "To date, the U.S. government has not been able to determine the origin of the money used for the 9/11 attacks. Ultimately, the question is of little practical significance. Al-Qaeda had many avenues of funding. If a particular funding source had dried up, Al-Qaeda could have easily tapped a different source or diverted funds from another project to fund an operation that cost $400,000 to $500,000 over nearly 2 years." End quote. Yes, it's of very little practical significance where Al-Qaeda got the money for the attacks from, because Al-Qaeda could have gotten that money from many places, because Al-Qaeda has many different sources of funding, and since Al-Qaeda can get that money from many different sources, we don't have to investigate how Al-Qaeda got that money. Does anyone else get the impression that perhaps the 9/11 Commission report had come to certain conclusions about who did finance the attacks before the report was even written? Yes, I thought so. Well, let's explore some of the very troubling issues related to the 9/11 financing and hopefully, ultimately, come to a better understanding of how the attacks were perpetrated and by whom. And today we'll start with one of the most obvious and basic examples of how one individual stood to make $4.5 billion off of this horrific and tragic loss of life.
Silverstein, a commercial real estate tycoon with international political connections, acquired a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center complex in the spring of 2001. Throughout the summer, he reworked the insurance policies on his new property, making sure that it was covered for acts of terrorism. Explicit in the lease agreement was Silverstein's right to rebuild the complex if it were destroyed. After 9/11, Mr. Silverstein fought his insurers in court to obtain double his policy limits for the destruction of his property, maintaining that the double hijacking constituted 2 disasters caused by terrorists, not just one. He won, and was awarded over $7 billion, a magnificent return on his original $15 million investment. Not long after the disaster, Lower Manhattan saw banners like this one. Although they were idolized as cathedral-like symbols of power and triumph that pierced the New York skyline, the Twin Towers were big money losers for the Port Authority of New York. They cost millions a year to equip with the basics: electricity, water, heat, air conditioning, sewage, and even oxygen, being airtight. As modern communications connected traders from all corners of the globe, tenancy in the Twin Towers continued to drop. The towers presented another problem. Decades ago, their steel beams had been sprayed with fireproof asbestos, a cancer-causing material banned from use in building in the mid-1980s. Although the World Trade Center complex was given several waivers, it was expected to clean up its act. But to remove the asbestos from every supporting beam in the Twin Towers would have been almost undoable. Quotes for this cleanup ran over $1 billion, and no insurance company was willing to bear the cost. An urban renewal project of unfathomable proportions. Given the tower's issues and problems, September 11th proved an unexpected bonanza. The Trade Center was built in the 1960s to revive a rundown area of New York, and 40 years later, urban renewal could again take place. 2 white elephants were removed, and a brand new complex is in the works. The full height of the new Freedom Tower will soar to 1,776 feet.
Of course, Lucky Larry's acquisition of the World Trade Center just weeks before 9/11 is by now a well-known story, but one would be advised to check a Bloomberg.com article from 2007 entitled "Silverstein Insurers Reach $2 Billion WTC Settlement" for details of the final settlement, which brought to $4.55 billion the amount that Larry Silverstein made for the deaths of those thousands of people in the World Trade Center on that day. As I say, that story is fairly well known, but another story which is not so well known comes from a report from the Populist Party, PopulistAmerica.com, from April 5th, 2007, Giuliani versus the Firefighters. This article reads in part, quote, Giuliani's cult hero status went untarnished and unchallenged until he decided to decline an invitation to the International Association for Firefighters Forum, open to all presidential candidates for Q&A. Mainstream news then picked up on the story and exposed the contention between the former mayor and the real heroes, the New York firefighters, who lost so many of their friends and compatriots in the attacks of that day. All was not well in Oz, and finally someone had alluded to the mask shadowing the truth. A great rift exists between Giuliani and the one group America assumes to be his staunchest allies. What did Giuliani do that so outraged the firefighters and their families that they would still hold such a grudge against him 5 years later? One cannot understand the source of this contention unless one has done some real and difficult research into the events of that day. In November 2001, our members were continuing the painful but necessary task of searching Ground Zero for the remains of our fallen brothers and the thousands of innocent citizens that were killed, because precious few of those who died in the terrorist attacks had been recovered at that point. Prior to November 2001, 101 bodies or remains of firefighters had been recovered, and those on the horrible pile at Ground Zero believed they had just found a spot in the rubble where they would find countless more that could be given proper burial. Nevertheless, Giuliani, with the full support of the Fire Commissioner Thomas von Essen, decided on November 2nd, 2001, to sharply reduce the number of those who could search for remains at any one time. There had been as many as 300 firefighters at a time involved in search and recovery, but Giuliani cut that number to no more than 25 who could be there at once. Here is where the mainstream falls short in their reporting. Why would Giuliani all of a sudden forcefully remove firefighters from the pile, and in such a way that resulted in a brawl between the NYPD and NYFD? What the mainstream press will never dig into or question is, why did Giuliani place more importance on cleaning up the pile than in taking a slow retrieval approach to accessing the bodies of firefighters, police, and emergency workers still trapped in the wreckage of those buildings? Though 2 months later, chances were that no one was still alive, many still clung to the hope that loved ones would be dug out of the devastation of those destroyed buildings. Families wanted a chance for closure, bodies of their loved ones returned so that they could honor them with a proper memorial and burial. The firefighters believed that the city went to a scoop and dump policy because they were in a rush to retrieve gold. The fact is that the mayor's switch to a scoop and dump coincided with the final removal of tens of millions of dollars of gold, silver, and other assets of the Bank of Nova Scotia that were buried beneath what was once the towers. Once the money was out, Giuliani sided with the developers that opposed the lengthy recovery effort and ordered the scoop and dump operation so they could proceed with redevelopment. With his training as district attorney for New York, Giuliani knows from his prosecutor days that the first rule of a criminal investigation is in cordoning off a crime scene and preventing the tampering or removal of any piece of evidence within that area. Usually officers are put in place to prevent the eradication, removal of, or disruption of anything within that scene. Surely the events of September 11, 2001 constitute the most egregious, barbaric, terroristic, and criminal act ever perpetuated on American soil. End quote. Now, as that article details in some length, the issues of Giuliani and the crime scene of Ground Zero in the weeks and months following 9/11 involve not only the criminal act of tampering with the evidence of that crime scene, which included, as we've detailed in previous episodes of the Corbett Report podcast, preventing even volunteer teams of researchers from studying the remains of those towers to try to come to a better understanding of how they collapsed, instead making the sole purpose of the entire operation on Ground Zero that of dismantling the pile and getting rid of the evidence as quickly as possible. And here we have another missing clue as to why this may have happened. And according to the firefighters, at any rate, it's because of the tens of millions and, according to some reports, billions of dollars of gold which were hidden underneath the World Trade Center and which had to be removed as quickly as possible. Now, there are unsubstantiated theories on the internet that the billions of dollars that were hidden in the various vaults under the World Trade Center complex may have been tampered with on the day of 9/11 as the attacks were taking place, that in fact 9/11 may have had elements of a gigantic bank heist. Now again, I can't vouch for the validity of these reports, but I do think they're interesting and worth looking into as another possible clue on the 9/11 money trail. But one very real and very important 9/11 money trail clue came out not on 9/11, but on 9/10. On that day, Donald Rumsfeld made a cold and calculating announcement that, in fact, the Pentagon had lost $2.3 trillion. Again, that's $2.3 trillion with a T, which represented about the same amount of money for the entire federal budget of the same year. How $2.3 trillion could go missing from the Pentagon has never been accurately explained. To get more details of this story, let's listen to the following news report.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten.
My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion, with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. To understand how the Pentagon can lose track of trillions, consider the case of one military accountant who tried to find out what happened to a mere $300 million.
We know it's gone, but we don't know what they spent it on.
Jim Minery, a former Marine turned whistleblower, is risking his job by speaking out for the first time about the millions he noticed were missing from one defense agency's balance sheets. Minery tried to follow the money trail, even crisscrossing the country looking for records.
The director looked at me and he says, "Why do you care about this stuff?" It took me aback, you know. My supervisor asked me why I care about doing a good job. So
he was reassigned and says officials then covered up the problem by just writing it off.
they got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in. They've got to cover up the fact that they can't do the job.
The Pentagon's Inspector General partially substantiated several of Minery's allegations, but could not prove officials tried to manipulate the financial statements. 20 years ago, Pentagon employee Franklin C. Spinney made headlines exposing what he calls the accounting games. He's still there, and although he does not speak for the Pentagon, he believes the problem has gotten worse.
Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
Retired Vice Admiral Jack Shanahan commanded the Navy's Second Fleet the first time Donald Rumsfeld served as Defense Secretary.
With good financial oversight, we could find $48 billion in loose change in that building without having to hit the taxpayers.
In the 2.5 minutes since this report began, the Pentagon has spent nearly $2 million, and it may never know where 25% of those tax dollars went.
Incredible nature of that admission, $2.3 trillion simply missing from the Pentagon, announced casually the day before 9/11. It was never followed up on in the controlled corporate media, who had other agendas to cover after, of course, the events of that day. One brief bright ray of hope occurred in 2005 when Representative Cynthia McKinney grilled Donald Rumsfeld during the House hearings on the 2006 budget for the U.S. Department of Defense. Let's listen to McKinney as she questions Rumsfeld on the missing trillions and hear Rumsfeld's pathetic response.
I thank the gentleman, the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McKinney.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I watched President Bush deliver a moving speech at the United Nations in September 2003, in which he mentioned the crisis of the sex trade. The President called for the punishment of those involved in this horrible business. But at the very moment of that speech, DynCorp was exposed for having been involved in the buying and selling of young women and children. While all of this was going on, DynCorp kept the Pentagon contract to administer the smallpox and anthrax vaccines and is now working on a plague vaccine through the Joint Vaccine Acquisition Program. Mr. Secretary, is it policy of the U.S. government to reward companies that traffic in women and little girls? That's my first question. My second question, Mr. Secretary, according to the Comptroller General of the United States, there are serious financial management problems at the Pentagon, to which Mr. Cooper alluded. Fiscal year 1999, $2.3 trillion missing. Fiscal year 2000, $1.1 trillion missing. And DOD is the #1 reason why the government can't balance its checkbook. The Pentagon has claimed year after year that the reason it can't account for the money is because its computers don't communicate with each other. My second question, Mr. Secretary, is who has the contracts today to make those systems communicate with each other? How long have they had those contracts? and how much have the taxpayers paid for them? Finally, Mr. Secretary, after the last hearing, I thought that my office was promised a written response to my question regarding the 4 war games on September 11th. I have not yet received that response, but would like for you to respond to the questions that I've put to you today, and then I do expect the written response to my previous question, hopefully by the end of the week.
Thank you, Representative. First, the answer to your first question is no, absolutely not. The policy of the United States government is clear, unambiguous, and opposed to the activities that you described. The second question.
Well, how do you explain the fact that DynCorp and its successor companies have received and continue to receive government contracts?
I would have to go and find the facts, but there are laws and rules and regulations with respect to government contracts, and there are times that corporations do things they should not do, in which case they tend to be suspended for some period. There are times then that under the laws and the rules and regulations passed by the Congress and implemented by the executive branch, that corporations can get off of out of the penalty box, if you will, and be permitted to engage in contracts with the government. They're not generally not barred in perpetuity.
This company was never in the penalty box. If you could proceed to my second question, please.
The second question, I've forgotten what the second question was.
I think Ms. Jonas knows it.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. McKinney. I appreciate the question. I appreciate your interest in our department's financial condition, and we are working very hard on that program. I've just come back recently.
I understand that you're working hard on it, but my question was, who has the contract? How long have they had that contract, and how much money have we spent on it?
In general, we spend about $20 billion in the Department on Information Technology Systems. The accounting systems are part of that. I can get you the exact number for the record of what we spend on our current, what we call legacy systems, and those that we're moving toward.
And who has the contracts?
That would be a multitude of individuals.
Could you name some, please?
Well, I think off the top of my head, well, I would rather not. I'd rather provide that for the record.
That's not privileged information, is it?
I'm sure it's not.
Well, please. Yeah. And we still have time, so please.
I would be glad to provide for the record. I don't want to talk from the top of my head and be incorrect.
On your first question, I'm advised by Dr. Chu that it was not the corporation that was engaged in the activities you characterized, but I'm told it was an employee of the corporation, and it was some years ago in the Balkans that took place.
It's my understanding that it continues to take place, and
is that right?
Yes.
Well, if you can give me information to that effect,
I'm sure you are interested in all of the information that I have, and I'll be more than happy to provide it to you.
Good, thank you.
But I would also like to get information from you.
Okay.
For example, the information that I just requested about who has those contracts.
Certainly. Let me assure the gentlelady that we'll make sure that this exchange of information takes place, and Mr. Secretary, if you can get back with us on the DynCorp story, we'll get that to the gentlelady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll get back on both of the first two questions, but the Congresswoman has raised the other question twice now, and I'd like to have General Myers respond because you mentioned it in the last hearing, and I think it would be helpful to get the answer, even though we're on red, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman.
General Myers, go right ahead.
But I would like to have the answer in writing as well, as I thought my office was promised.
Okay, I don't know about the promise, Congresswoman, but could you repeat the question to make sure I'm answering the right question? This is 9/11 question.
The question was, we had 4 war games going on September 11th, and the question that I tried to pose before the Secretary had to go to lunch was whether or not the activities of the 4 war games going on September 11th actually impaired our ability to respond to the attacks.
The answer to the question is no, did not impair our response. In fact, General Eberhart, who was then the commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command, as he testified in front of the 9/11 Commission, I believe he told them that it enhanced our ability to respond, given that NORAD didn't have the overall responsibility for responding to the attacks today. That was an FAA responsibility. But they were two CPXs. There was one Department of Justice exercise that didn't have anything to do with the other three, and there was an actual operation ongoing because there was some Russian bomber activity up near Alaska. So
let me ask you this then. Who was in charge of managing those war games?
And in general, why don't you give the best answer you can here in a short period of time, and we'll. The gentlelady wants to get a written answer anyway, and then we can move on to other folks.
The important thing to realize is North American Aerospace Defense Command was responsible. These are command post exercises. What that means is all the battle positions that are normally not filled are indeed filled. So it was an easy transition from an exercise into a real-world situation. It actually enhanced the response. Otherwise, it would take somewhere between 30 minutes and a couple of hours to fill those positions, those battle spaces, with the right staff officers.
Mr. Chairman, begging your indulgence, was September 11th declared a National Security Special Event Day?
I'd have to look back. I do not know. You mean after the fact or before the...
No, because of the activities going on that had been scheduled at the United Nations that day.
I'd have to go back and check. Don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. I thank the gentlelady. The chair would ask the gentleman from South Carolina to indulge us in that I should have called on Mr. Marshall here in the regular order and missed him, and the gentleman was here. So, is that okay, Mr. Wilson? We'll recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate Mr. Wilson's indulgence.
Well, you're going to owe him.
Probably not very much.
When they analyzed the stock market after 9/11, the CIA discovered a massive shorting of airline stocks. When the stocks hit bottom on 9/12, somebody made a fortune.
I gotta be honest with you. When the September 11 situation happened, I didn't know that. And I must say, and I want to say this because I want to take it lightly. It's not a light situation. It's a devastating act. It was really a bad thing. It was one of the worst things I've seen in my lifetime, But I will tell you, and every trader will tell you, who was not in that building and who was buying gold and who owned gold and silver, that when it happened, the first thing you thought about was, well, how much is gold up? The first thing that came to mind was, my God, gold must be exploding. Fortunately for us, all our clients were in gold. So when it went up, they all doubled their money. Everybody doubled their money. It was a blessing in disguise. Devastating, crushing, heart-shattering, but on a financial sense, for my clients that were in the market, they all made money. Now, I wasn't looking for this type of help. But it happened. When the U.S. bombed Iraq back in 1991, the price of oil went from $13 to $40 a barrel, for Christ's sake. Now, we couldn't wait for the bombs to start raining down on Saddam Hussein. We were all excited. We wanted Saddam to really create problems. Do whatever you have to do. Set fire to some more oil wells because the price is going to go higher. Every broker was chanting that. There was not a broker that I know of that wasn't excited about that. This was a disaster. This was something that was, catastrophe happening, bombing, wars. In devastation, there is opportunity. Opportunity, 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 opportunity.
A put option is a bet that a stock price is going to fall. If one were to put a single put option contract on American Airlines at $30 a share and the stock fell to $18, one could purchase 100 shares at $18 and immediately sell them for $30, netting a profit of $12 a share. This is exactly what happened on a far larger scale with many companies around the world on 9/11. The levels of options purchased the week of 9/11 were more than 6 times higher than normal. A former member of the German parliament, then responsible for oversight of the German Secret Service, estimated that profits by insider traders were $15 billion.
Wall Street analyst Phil Erlinger was the first to spot the suspicious trades.
What I see is prior knowledge. You can call it conspiracy. It's my opinion that somebody knew ahead of time that 9/11 was going to happen, and they made bets to take advantage of it. And these bets weren't just normal run-of-the-day bets. They were far in excess of what we would call normal activity.
Put options set to expire on September 30th, 2001, were bought on August 6, 2001, or earlier, at the Chicago Board Options Exchange.
These put options were basically a bet that the stock would plummet. When it did, the people who purchased those put options made a lot of money.
Thousands of put stock options were bought on United and American Airlines immediately prior to September 11th, 2001. On average, during the first weeks of September 2001, 27 put options were bought each day on Morgan Stanley, one of the World Trade Center's largest occupants. The total of its put options for the 3 days prior to the attacks was 2,157. Merrill Lynch, also in the WTC, saw 12,215 put stock options. That is 12 times its normal level. Between September 6th and 7th, Chicago Board Options Exchange saw 4,744 put option contracts with United Airlines and only 396 call options. On September 10th, put options for American Airlines totaled 4,516 versus 748 call options. In addition, these trades were not only occurring in our country, but around the world. There is no chance that all or even most of the trades were placed by Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. According to Fox News, CNN, and the BBC, insider trading reports were found in the USA, Germany, Britain, France, Canada, Japan, Monte Carlo, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Singapore. The director of the CIA headed a firm that bought some of these put stock options. Until 1998, Buzzy Krongard headed United Airlines stock. Mr. Krongard was head of Bankers Trust until he resigned and was promoted to CIA Executive Director by President Bush in March 2001. Buzzy Krongard purchased this stock, and our government did nothing about it. Deutsche Bank is also one of the 4 banks most used by the bin Laden family. Additionally, $2.5 million in put options on United and American Airlines went unclaimed. The German central bank president, Ernst Weltec, had a study conducted by his bank. It indicated, quote, "There are ever clearer signs that there were activities on international financial markets that must have been carried out with the necessary expert knowledge in industries such as gold, oil, airlines, and insurance companies."
There was a lot of money to be made from the events of September 11th. And indeed, many people in our own government called the events of September 11th an opportunity.
The firm used to place the put options on United Airlines stock was managed until 1998 by the man who is now the number 3 executive director position at the CIA. A.B. Buzzy Krongard became vice chairman of Bankers Trust when the 2 firms merged, and his new position was to oversee private client relationships. Krongard had a special hands-on relationship with some of the wealthiest people in the world in a specialized banking operation that Senator Carl Levin identified as being connected to the laundering of drug money. Bankers Trust was acquired by Deutsche Bank in 1999 to form the single largest bank in Europe. Before 9/11, Kevin Ingram, an executor for Bankers Trust Deutsche Bank, pled guilty to laundering money to finance terrorist operations for groups linked to Osama bin Laden. Deutsche Bank has been a favorite of the bin Laden family and was connected to the hijackers and their support network. Deutsche Bank had corresponding relationships with banks in Bahrain and Kuwait that served George W. Bush when he engaged in illegal insider trading of shares of his company Harkin Energy. Both banks, Kuwait Finance House and Faisal Islamic Bank of Bahrain, had dealt with Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. But when the Bush administration released its worldwide list of suspect financial institutions vowing to track down terrorist financing, neither bank was on the list. Mayo Shattuck III is a powerful force in the financial world. Head of the Alex Brown Deutsche Bank on 9/11, he had previously been involved in Enron, helping them conceal their massive debt, as well as involved in an insider trading scam involving Adnan Khashoggi's Genesis Intermedia immediately before 9/11. He was midway through a 3-year, $30 million contract as head of Alex Brown when the attacks came, and under his management, some of the illegal trades on United Airlines were placed. Mayo Shattuck has taken over Alex Brown operations in 1997 after Krongard had officially gone to the CIA in 1998. Mayo Shattuck III resigned on the day after 9/11.